In 1987, a man walked into a hospital in Leicestershire, gave a blood sample under someone else's name, and walked out again. He was the first person in history to try to beat a DNA test, and he very nearly did. What caught him was not science. It was a woman in a pub, listening to a conversation she was not part of, who waited 6 weeks before telling anyone what she had heard. And by the time the case was finished, forensic DNA had done two things nobody expected. It had convicted its first killer. And before that, months before, it had freed an innocent teenager who had already confessed. That is the part of this story that gets left out. The technique that put a man away for life was used first to prove that the police had the wrong person. Start in November 1983 on a footpath called the Black Pad between the villages of Narborough and Enderby. Linda Mann was 15. She had gone out that evening to visit a friend and had taken the path as a shortcut on the way home. She never arrived. Her body was found the next morning, raped and strangled, a short distance from the road. The investigation was substantial and it went nowhere. There was semen at the scene, and the forensic science of the day could do something with that, but not much. Conventional serology could type it as blood group A with an enzyme profile shared by around 10% of adult men. In a county of that size, 10% is not a clue, it is a crowd. The file stayed open, and after a while it stopped being worked in the way that cases do. 3 years later, in July 1986, a 15-year-old called Dawn Ashworth took a shortcut down a path called 10-Pound Lane, less than a mile from where Linda had died. She was found 2 days later in a field, concealed under branches, raped and strangled. The same forensic profile, the same age of victim, the same kind of footpath in the same small cluster of villages. Now the police had a linked double murder and a community in a state that is difficult to overstate. 2 schoolgirls, 3 years apart, in villages of a few thousand people where everybody knew everybody. And within a fortnight they had a confession. A 17-year-old kitchen porter at a nearby psychiatric hospital had been seen near the scene. He had a learning disability. He was interviewed at length and he told them things. He described the body, he described the field, he gave details that had not been released. He confessed to killing Dawn Ashworth. He also denied consistently and throughout having anything to do with Linda Mann. That combination is what saved him because it made no sense. The 2 killings were so alike that the investigating officers were certain they had one offender. A confession to one and a flat denial of the other was a problem, not a result. So Chief Superintendent David Baker did something that had never been done before. He had heard that a geneticist at the University of Leicester, 10 miles away, had developed a technique for identifying individuals from their DNA. Alec Jeffreys had made the discovery about 18 months earlier, and by his own account it happened at 9:05 on a Monday morning in September 1984, looking at an X-ray film in a darkroom. He had been studying variation in a gene, and what came up on the film was a pattern of bands, different for every person he tested, and inherited in a way that meant a child's bands could be traced to their parents. He described it afterwards as a moment of realizing the applications faster than he could write them down. Within a couple of years, the technique had been used in an immigration dispute to prove that a boy returning to Britain was really his mother's son, and in a paternity case. It had never been used in a murder investigation. It is worth understanding what he had actually found, because the name is misleading. DNA fingerprinting has nothing to do with fingerprints, and in 1984 it did not read genes in any sense a modern reader would recognize. What Jeffreys had noticed was that scattered through human DNA are stretches of sequence that repeat over and over, the same short pattern, tandem after tandem. These are called minisatellites, and the useful thing about them is that the number of repeats varies enormously between people. One person might have 11 copies at a particular location, another might have 30. Any single one of those locations is not very informative, but if you look at many of them at once, the combination becomes effectively unique. The method for reading them was laborious by any modern standard. Cut the DNA with an enzyme that slices at specific sequences, so the repeat regions come out as fragments whose length depends on how many repeats they contain. Separate those fragments by size by running them through a gel with an electric current. Smaller pieces travel further. Transfer the pattern onto a membrane, wash it with a radioactive probe that sticks only to the repeat sequences, and lay it against X-ray film. What develops is a column of dark bands, like a barcode, and the pattern is different for every person on Earth except identical twins. That is what Jeffries was looking at in the darkroom on that Monday morning in September 1984, and what he saw was not the biology. He had expected the variation. What he saw was that he could tell people apart, and that a child's bands were a legible mixture of their mothers and their fathers. The applications arrived, by his own account, in about 5 minutes: paternity, immigration disputes, identifying remains, and criminal casework. The limitation in 1984 was the amount of material required. The original technique needed a relatively large, undegraded sample, a good bloodstain, not a trace. Semen from a murder scene, recovered promptly, was among the few forensic samples that qualified. It is partly luck that the first case to test it happened to be one where the evidence was of a kind the method could actually read. Everything modern forensics does, with a few cells and amplification, came later. In 1986, the technique was powerful and blunt. Give it enough material and it would tell you who, and give it a trace and it would tell you nothing. Now, the investigation before any of that. The 1983 inquiry into Linda Mann's murder was not a small effort. Officers took statements across the villages, checked local men with relevant records, and pursued the forensic evidence as far as the science of the day allowed. What the science allowed was a blood group and an enzyme type, which described roughly 1 man in 10. There is a particular frustration in that kind of evidence. It is real, it is scientific, and it cannot narrow anything. It can only exclude, and it excludes 90%, which sounds impressive until you count how many men that leaves in a commuter belt outside Leicester. After several months, the inquiry wound down, not closed but reduced, which is what happens when a team runs out of leads and other cases arrive. Then Dawn Ashworth died in July 1986, and everything about the first case became urgent again, because a linked series is a different problem from a single killing. It means the offender is local, still there, and not finished. The second inquiry was very large, hundreds of officers, house to house across 3 villages, every man with any relevant conviction pulled in and interviewed. And Colin Pitchfork was interviewed during that process, more than once, in connection with his indecent exposure record. He gave an account of his movements. It was checked in the way that hundreds of accounts were checked, and it held up well enough to move on. He was inside the investigation from the beginning. He was simply one name among a great many, with an alibi supplied in part by his wife, who had no idea what she was providing an alibi for. The police sent Jeffries the samples, the semen from both murders and blood from the boy who had confessed. And the result came back, and it was not what anyone wanted. The 2 murders were committed by the same man. That part confirmed what the police believed. But that man was not the boy in custody. His DNA did not match either sample. Consider the position that put everybody in. A 17-year-old had confessed, in detail, to a murder he had not committed. The police had the confession, they had believed it, and they now had a piece of laboratory evidence from a technique so new that no court had ever ruled on it, telling them their case was wrong. Jeffries later said he was so surprised that he repeated the analysis to make sure. The Home Office did their own testing. The result held. The boy was released in November 1986 after 3 months in custody. He is the first person in the world to be exonerated by DNA evidence, which happened before anybody had ever been convicted by it. That order of events matters, and it is almost always told the wrong way round. The technique's first act was not to catch a guilty man. It was to contradict a confession the police already had and let an innocent one go. It is also worth being honest about why he confessed, because false confessions are not rare and the reasons are well documented. He was young, he had a learning disability, and he was questioned at length. Interviews of that period were not routinely recorded in full. Details that seem to prove knowledge can arrive in the room from the questioner without anyone intending it, an assumption in a question, a photograph on a table. The case became one of the reasons English interviewing practice changed, but that is later. In 1986, the police had lost their suspect, and they had a technique that could identify their offender if only they had something to compare him to, which produced the most extraordinary decision in the case. They asked every man in 3 villages to give a sample of blood voluntarily. The appeal went out in January 1987 to unmarried men between 17 and 34 in Narborough, Littlethorpe and Enderby. It was not compulsory. There was no power to make anyone do it. But in a community where 2 local girls had been murdered, refusing was its own kind of statement, and everybody understood that. Over the following months, around 5,000 men came forward. They queued in village halls and a local school. Men took time off work for it. Fathers brought sons who had just turned 17. Some traveled back from other parts of the country to be tested in the village they had grown up in, because they knew that being on the list and not turning up would follow them. Nothing on that scale had been attempted anywhere in the world, and there was no precedent for how to run it, the paperwork, the storage, the sheer number of vials. The process was 2-stage, and the reason is money. Full DNA analysis in 1987 was slow and expensive, so the samples were first screened by conventional blood grouping, which eliminated roughly 9 in 10 immediately. Only the small remainder that matched the offender's blood type went on to DNA testing. 6 months of collection, 5,000 men, not one match. Think about what that meant to the investigation. The offender was almost certainly local, the geography said so. He had been asked to give blood along with everybody else. And either he had refused, which would have been noticed, or he had given a sample and it had not matched. There is no third possibility, unless somebody else had given a sample in his name. It is worth sitting with how bleak that position was for the investigating team, because it is the low point of the case and it lasted months. They had a technique that could identify their man with certainty. They had spent 6 months and a great deal of money collecting the largest set of voluntary forensic samples ever taken anywhere. They had the cooperation of an entire community, and the answer that came back was nothing. There are only a handful of explanations for that, and the team went through all of them. He might not be local after all, but the geography argued hard against it. 2 footpaths less than a mile apart, both shortcuts known to residents rather than through routes. In villages, a stranger would have no reason to be walking at night. He might be outside the age band. The screen ran from 17 to 34, which is a judgment rather than a fact, and an offender of 36 would have walked straight through the gap. He might have moved away between 1983 and 1987, or died, or been imprisoned for something else. Or he had been sampled and the sample was not his. That last possibility was understood at the time. It is the obvious hole in a voluntary scheme that relies on people turning up and saying who they are. What could not be done was anything about it. There was no way to detect a substitution after the fact. Every sample in the collection carried a name written down by the person who handed it over, and the only check was whatever document they produced at the desk. So the investigation sat with a database of 5,000 negatives, knowing that one of them might be a lie, and no method of finding out which. Which brings us to a pub in Leicester in August 1987, and a conversation over a drink. A group of colleagues from a bakery were out. One of them, a man called Ian Kelly, said something he should not have said. He mentioned that he had given a blood sample pretending to be a colleague, a man named Colin Pitchfork, because Pitchfork had asked him to. Pitchfork had said he had already given a sample for someone else and was worried about being caught out. He said he was frightened of being fitted up because of an indecent exposure conviction. Kelly had agreed. Pitchfork had altered his own passport, substituting Kelly's photograph, so Kelly could present himself at the sampling center as Pitchfork and pass the identity check. A woman at the table heard this. Her name was not made public at the time. She did not go to the police that night or the next week. She waited 6 weeks. It is worth trying to imagine those 6 weeks properly, because everything in this case ultimately rests on them. She works with these men. Kelly is a colleague. Pitchfork is a colleague, a married baker with 2 young children, well enough liked, the sort of person whose life would be comprehensively destroyed by an accusation like this whether or not it turned out to be true. And what she has is a fragment of a conversation in a pub, half heard, involving drink, on a subject the whole county had been talking about for a year. She could have misheard the names, she could have misunderstood a joke, Kelly might have been showing off about something that never happened. Against that, the possibility that 2 15-year-old girls were dead, and the man responsible was sitting in the same building as her every working day. There is no version of that 6 weeks that is comfortable. Going to the police risks ruining innocent people on a misheard remark. Not going risks a third girl. She went, and the reason we know almost nothing about her is that she was never publicly named, not at the time, not since. She has no interviews, no documentary appearances, no book. The largest forensic operation in British history to that point produced nothing, and the case was closed by a person who overheard something she was not meant to hear, and then thought about it for a month and a half before doing the difficult thing. That detail is worth pausing on, because it is the most human thing in the case. She had heard something that, if she had misunderstood it, would destroy a colleague's life. If she had understood it correctly, she was sitting on the solution to 2 murders. She thought about it for a month and a half before telling anyone. When she did, the police moved. Kelly was arrested and admitted the substitution immediately. And on the 20th of September 1987, Colin Pitchfork was arrested at his home. He is reported to have said very little at first, and then, when the substitution was put to him, to have asked whether it was about the blood test. It is the sort of remark that only makes sense from a man who had been waiting 8 months to find out whether the arrangement had held. He gave a blood sample, his own this time. The DNA matched both murders, and it matched them absolutely. The same man on the black pad in 1983 and in 10 Pound Lane in 1986, which was the one thing the investigation had believed from the start and had never been able to prove. He was a baker, he was married with 2 children. He lived in Littlethorpe at the centre of the 3 villages, which is to say that during the 6 months of the screen, while 5,000 of his neighbours queued to give blood because 2 local girls had been murdered, he was living among them, going to work, and had already arranged for somebody else to take the test in his place. He had been out driving with his baby son asleep in the back of the car on the night he killed Linda Mann. He pulled over and left the child in the car. He had a history of indecent exposure going back years, hundreds of incidents by his own admission, and had been referred for treatment. He was not a stranger passing through. He was a local man with a record of escalating sexual offending, living inside the search area, who had been in the frame of nobody's suspicion. He pleaded guilty in January 1988 and was sentenced to life. The guilty plea is itself a consequence of the technique. There was no realistic defense available. In an ordinary case of that era, a competent barrister could work on identification, on the reliability of witnesses, on the gap between a blood group shared by 10% of men and the man in the dock. None of that was open here. The evidence did not say he was one of a group who could have done it. It said he did it. That is the change the case introduced to the courts, and it happened before any jury had ever been asked to weigh DNA evidence, because the first defendant to face it did not contest it. The arguments about how to present statistical match probabilities to a jury and how easily those figures are misunderstood all came in later cases. Pitchfork simply pleaded. Before the significance, the 2 people at the center of it, because a case that is famous for a technique has a way of losing them. Linda Mann was 15. She lived in Narborough, she had a sister, and on the evening of the 21st of November 1983, she went out to visit a friend and to drop in on another. She was walking home. The black pad was the route everybody used, a footpath along the back of the village that saved 10 minutes. She had walked it hundreds of times. Her mother reported her missing that night. She was found the following morning. Dawn Ashworth was 15. She lived in Enderby. 3 years later, and on the 31st of July 1986, she took 10 Lane as a shortcut on her way back from visiting friends in Narborough. It was a summer evening. She was 2 days from starting a holiday job. Her body was found on the 2nd of August in a field covered over. Both were local girls taking a local shortcut on an ordinary evening, less than a mile apart, 3 years apart, by a man who lived in the middle of the two villages and whose children would have grown up walking the same paths. That is the shape of the thing that the forensic story tends to obscure. What follows, the discovery, the exoneration, the screen, the pub, is genuinely one of the most consequential sequences in the history of criminal investigation. But it began because 2 children were killed on their way home, and everything the technique went on to become is downstream of that. The villages themselves did not recover quickly. 3 years of an unsolved child murder, then a second one, then a suspect charged and released, then 6 months of every adult male being asked to prove he was not responsible. By the time Pitchfork was arrested, the communities had spent 4 years suspecting one another, and the answer turned out to be a man most of them knew by sight. Alec Jeffreys has spoken about meeting the families. He has said that the science was the easy part. Now what this case actually established, because it is more than a first. It proved DNA evidence worked in both directions, and it did the exculpatory half first. That sequence gave the technique a credibility that a conviction alone would not have. A method that only ever confirms what the police already think is a method with a problem. This one began by telling them they were wrong. It established mass screening as a tool and simultaneously demonstrated its limits. 5,000 men, 6 months, enormous cost, and it did not catch him. He was caught by a person overhearing a conversation. The screen's real contribution was indirect. It created a situation where he had to commit a fresh, deliberate act of evasion, and that act is what exposed him. That is worth stating plainly because the case is often told as a triumph of the screening. It was not. The screening failed. What it did was force him to do something that required an accomplice, and accomplices talk. It also created a new offense. In effect, Ian Kelly was convicted of perverting the course of justice. The idea that you could defeat a forensic database by sending somebody else is now a standard part of how sampling is administered. Identity checks at the point of collection exist because of this case. And it changed the shape of British policing in a more general way. Within a decade, the UK had established the world's first national DNA database. Every one of the arguments we now have about it, who goes on it, how long they stay, whether the innocent should be retained, descends from a technique that was demonstrated for the first time on a footpath in Leicestershire. It is also worth saying what the technique could not do, then or now, because the case is sometimes used to suggest forensic certainty is available on demand. DNA identifies a person. It does not date an act, it does not describe intent, and it does not distinguish between contact that mattered and contact that did not. In 1987, that limitation was hidden by the circumstances. The samples came from the bodies of 2 murdered children, so the question of how the material got there did not arise. In the decades since, as sensitivity improved to the point where a profile can be recovered from a few cells, the question arises constantly: traces transfer. They move on hands, on clothing, on objects handled by several people. A profile at a scene now proves contact with something, at some point, by some route, which is a much weaker claim than the one the Pitchfork case appeared to establish. That is not a criticism of the science. It is a consequence of it getting better. The more sensitive the method, the more innocent explanations it picks up alongside the guilty ones. The 1987 version was crude enough that a result meant one thing. The modern version is precise enough to need an argument about how the material arrived. Alec Jeffreys has made this point himself on a number of occasions, generally to people who would rather he did not. There is a coda, and it is unresolved in a way that most true crime stories are not. Pitchfork was released on parole in September 2021, after 33 years. There was substantial public objection. He was recalled to prison within 2 months for approaching young women while out walking, behavior his license conditions prohibited. He has since been through further parole proceedings, and the case has become a recurring argument about what a life sentence is supposed to mean. There is also a strange footnote about the boy who confessed. He was 17 when he was arrested, and he has never been publicly named, which is right, but it means the first person in the world exonerated by DNA evidence is, to almost everybody, an anonymous figure in someone else's story. He spent 3 months in custody, accused of murdering a girl he had not touched. He then watched the technique that cleared him become the most celebrated advance in forensic science of the century, told largely as the story of the man it caught. Every DNA exoneration since, and in the United States alone the Innocence project counts hundreds, descends from a test run in Leicester in 1986 to check a confession that everybody involved already believed. Alec Jeffreys, who was knighted for the discovery, has said more than once that he did not anticipate any of it. He was studying inherited variation. The forensic application arrived in his head in a darkroom in a rush, and the first real test of it happened 10 miles from his laboratory, in villages he could have driven to in 20 minutes. The false confession deserves more than a passing mention, because it is the part of this case with the longest consequences. The boy was 17. He had a learning disability, and by the accounts given at the time, he was suggestible in the way that a great many young people are when placed in a police station for hours by adults who clearly believe they already know the answer. He was interviewed repeatedly over several days. His mother was not present for all of it. And in the course of those interviews, he produced details about the scene, where the body was, what had been done to conceal it, which is precisely the thing that makes a confession persuasive to investigators. Guilty knowledge, they call it. How would he know that if he was not there? The uncomfortable answer, established since across a large body of research, is that guilty knowledge leaks. It leaks through the phrasing of questions, through photographs left visible, through the interviewer's reaction when a guess lands close, through repeated returns to detail until the suspect works out what is wanted. None of that requires anybody to behave corruptly. It requires only that the questioner already believes the answer and is not aware of how much they are signaling. Interviews in 1986 were not comprehensively tape-recorded. What existed afterwards was largely a written summary produced by the officers. So there is no complete record of how those details entered the conversation, and there never can be. England and Wales changed the rules within a few years. The Police and Criminal Evidence Act had already begun to formalize interviewing, and the recording of interviews became mandatory. Appropriate adult safeguards for vulnerable suspects were tightened. By the 1990s, British interviewing had moved towards the model now known as investigative interviewing, gathering an account rather than pursuing a confession, which is taught internationally and was developed in significant part because of cases like this one. None of which is much comfort to a boy who spent 3 months in custody for a murder he had nothing to do with, and who was cleared only because a geneticist 10 miles away had made a discovery 18 months earlier. Now the screen itself and the argument it started. Asking 5,000 men to give blood was legally voluntary and practically nothing of the kind. Everybody in those villages knew who had been asked. Everybody would know who had refused. In a community where 2 local children had been murdered, the social pressure was total, and the police did not need any statutory power because the community supplied one. That is worth being clear-eyed about, because the case is usually told as an example of a community pulling together, and it was that. It was also a demonstration that a mass screen does not really need consent to be effective. It needs only the visibility of refusal. At the time, there was very little public objection. The circumstances were extreme, the technique was new and poorly understood, and the sense of threat in the villages was immediate. The objections came later, as the practice spread and as the national database grew, and they took a shape that is now familiar. What happens to the samples of the innocent, who decides what a match is worth, and whether being asked is itself a kind of accusation. Britain went on to build the first national DNA database in the world, in 1995. At its peak, it held profiles from several million people, including many who had been arrested and never charged. In 2008, the European Court of Human Rights ruled in S and MAPA that the blanket retention of samples from people never convicted breached the right to private life, and the law was changed to require most such profiles to be destroyed. Every one of those arguments traces back to 2 footpaths in Leicestershire, because that is where the technique was first shown to work. There is also the question of what pitchfork actually was, which the trial addressed and which most retellings skip. He had been exposing himself to women since his teens. He estimated the number of incidents in the hundreds. He had been referred to a hospital for treatment, the same hospital, as it happens, where the boy who falsely confessed worked in the kitchen. The psychiatric evidence at trial described a man with a serious and long-standing sexual disorder who had escalated. That escalation is the pattern the case is now used to illustrate: indecent exposure treated for decades as a nuisance offense, a minor thing, an embarrassment rather than a danger. He was not a stranger who appeared from nowhere. He was a man with a documented history of sexual offending, living in the middle of the search area, who had been interviewed, whose record was known, and who was not treated as a serious candidate because the offences on his file were the kind police forces of that era did not weight heavily. The judge sentencing him described the murders as particularly sadistic. He was given a life sentence with a recommendation, later formalized, of 30 years. And there is one more thing about the mechanics of his arrest that is easy to miss. Pitchfork did not simply send a friend. He altered a passport, removing his own photograph, fitting Ian Kelly's in its place, so that the substitute could pass the identity check at the sampling center. That is a planned, technical forgery, prepared in advance, by a man who had correctly worked out that the state was about to acquire a tool that could identify him from a stain left 4 years earlier. Most offenders in 1987 had no idea what DNA fingerprinting was. He understood it well enough to be frightened of it and to construct a countermeasure. The countermeasure is what convicted him. Had he simply given his own blood, he would have been identified, but had he refused, or moved away, or done nothing at all, the screen would have produced nothing, and there is a real possibility the case would still be open. He was caught because he was clever, and because being clever required an accomplice, and because the accomplice told the story in a pub. So what do we take from this one? The first thing is the order of events. DNA fingerprinting freed an innocent boy before it convicted a guilty man, and the boy had already confessed. Every time a confession is treated as the end of an investigation, this case is the counter-argument, and it is not a marginal example, it is the very first use of the technique. The second is that the enormous, expensive, unprecedented operation did not solve it. 5,000 samples produced nothing. What produced something was a man who could not keep quiet in a pub and a woman who thought hard for 6 weeks and then picked up the phone. The third is the thing that makes the whole case turn. Pitchfork's mistake was not leaving evidence. It was understanding, correctly and before almost anyone else, exactly how dangerous the new technique was to him, and acting on that understanding in a way that required somebody else to know. And the fourth is the thing the case says about how long evidence waits. Linda Mann died in November 1983. The material that identified her killer was recovered that same week, and it sat in a freezer, unreadable, for 3 years, not because anyone failed to test it, but because the test did not exist yet. Alec Jeffreys had not made his discovery when she was buried. The answer was already in the building, in a form nobody on Earth could yet interpret. That is now the ordinary condition of a cold case. Somewhere in an evidence store is a sample that will be readable by a method not yet invented, and the only requirement is that somebody kept it, and kept it properly. Which makes the least glamorous part of forensic work, labeling, storage, chain of custody, freezer space, budgets for holding material on cases nobody is actively investigating, the part that most often decides whether an answer ever arrives. 2 footpaths a mile apart, a stain that meant nothing for 3 years and everything afterwards. He was the first person to try to beat a DNA test. He was clever enough to see it coming and to plan around it. And that plan is the only reason he was caught.